If you followed the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard defamation trial, there's a certain name that came up multiple times. Yes, that's right, Marilyn Manson. I honestly still can't quite figure out why Amber Heard's team wanted to bring up Marilyn Manson so many times, because it just was a name that just bubbled up and it never seemed to be linked to any kind of facts. However, it takes about 2 seconds of investigating to understand that Marilyn Manson is involved in a case that does actually seem kind of similar to the Depp v. Heard trial. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome to Legalbytes. If you're new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we explain the law one bite at a time. So the Marilyn Manson versus Evan Rachel Wood / Illma Gore case cluster, I guess you could say, is essentially a cluster of cases that have popped up recently. Now, even though we're at the very beginning of this case, or these cases, I guess you could say, it seems like there's already been so much that's happened that it kind of gives me a little bit of a struggle for where to begin to investigate this case and to talk about this case, to be able to explain the laws to folks that are interested. So basically what I'm going to do is this is going to be a very quick intro video where we are going to talk about just some of the background landscape. And in the next video, I'm going to dive into the first document of the first case that we'll talk about, which is the Marilyn Manson or Brian Warner versus Evan Rachel Wood and Illma Gore defamation / intentional infliction of emotional distress case. Much longer name. We'll just shorten that to the defamation case. Basically, we'll get into the complaint and the basic allegations in that complaint. But for now, I feel like it's very important to kind of talk a little bit about who these two individuals are and why it's important that we go into this objectively as possible. And before I do that, let me just first say that this case arises from an allegation starting with Evan Rachel Wood against Brian Warner, also known as Marilyn Manson. I'm going to refer to him as Marilyn Manson because that's how we all know him as. But basically, she alleged DV against him. And now she has also found a number of other women that have also come forward and made similar claims against him and filed cases against him as well. There are several pieces of litigation that have been filed in recent years against Brian Warner or Marilyn Manson. And so now what he did was in March of this year, he filed a defamation case / IIED case against her and her now friend, maybe partner, Illma Gore, for a number of things that he says that they did, including sort of this whole accusation about DV, basically setting this whole thing up. So as you can tell, it does start to feel almost immediately very similar to the Depp v. Heard case. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when I say that is that I have very clearly made a conclusion about the Depp v. Heard case. Many of us have. Maybe all of us that have actually watched the case have come to our own conclusions about that case. Now, just because I say that this is similar in many ways to that case does not mean that I am transferring my conclusions about that case into this particular case. And I think that that is a very important point to keep in mind, that when we are looking at these cases, they are all individual fact-based analyses. We are always going to go into this facts first. Facts and the law. That's what we do here. We take the facts, we apply it to the law, and then we see what the conclusion is. Now, with that in mind, also the individuals that are involved in this case are very different than the individuals that were involved in Depp v. Heard. Before, we had Johnny Depp, who was the world's favorite pirate, right? This is the guy who is Captain Jack Sparrow, a beloved character who has been brought into the mainstream. He's a Disney character, for crying out loud. Then on the other hand, we have Brian Warner, also known as Marilyn Manson. He is in a very different position in terms of our society and the way that our society views someone like him. He basically can be described as a shock rocker who has always worn some very intense makeup. And a lot of his music and his music videos and a lot of the things that he has said and done over the years have been in a lot of ways intended to shock the mainstream. He's been one of these characters, you could say, that is sort of on the outskirts of society with the intent of making commentary about our mainstream society. So when you have someone who has taken it as their role in society to be that kind of an individual, it can in a lot of ways make them very, very vulnerable to some very real repercussions when it comes to the law, when it comes to the way that society reacts to that individual. As an example, currently, unfortunately, school shootings have been relatively commonplace. But the very first one that happened that at least became widely known across the United States was Columbine. This was back in the 90s, 2000s. I feel like it was the early 2000s, maybe. But basically, for one reason or another, he ended up getting blamed for that, either because the individuals that took those actions at that school that day were fans of his or fans of his aesthetic or something. For whatever reason, they decided to, they, meaning mainstream media or mainstream voices, you could say, decided to point a finger at Marilyn Manson and to say that he is actually ultimately responsible for these individuals. Today, looking back on that, it does seem a little bit ridiculous, especially because of the fact that it has become quite commonplace. It has become quite clear that the problems that have started those issues are far beyond one individual shock rocker. But back in the day, that probably was fairly devastating for someone like him. I would imagine so, regardless of what you think about his music or his aesthetic or his appeal. Now, at the same time, when I say that he has been used as a scapegoat in the past, that is not to dismiss the accusations against him, right? Because it also could be easy to look at that and to say, well, he's been used as a scapegoat in the past, so therefore this is another example of him being used as a scapegoat. That could very well be the reality in this situation, but maybe not. We don't know that until we have looked into the facts of this case. So let me give a little bit of a roadmap for what we're going to be doing in this, what I anticipate is going to be a bit of a long-term series. We'll be getting into, first and foremost, the case that was filed by Marilyn Manson against Evan Rachel Wood and Illma Gore. We'll start by getting into the complaint of that case and going through the basic accusations that he has made. Next, we'll also get into some anti-SLAPP motions that have been filed in that case by Evan Rachel Wood and by Illma Gore. Anti-SLAPP. Anti-SLAPP is spelled anti-SLAPP. The SLAPP in anti-SLAPP stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. And this was a subject that came up quite a bit in the Deputy Heard case. So if you are familiar with that, you will be familiar with anti-SLAPP for this particular case, although we are talking about California, which has some more specific mechanisms and it has a bit more teeth to the anti-SLAPP provisions in California law. Other stuff that we will definitely be getting into is the lawsuits that are filed against 4 other women against Marilyn Manson, some of which have already been dismissed, but we'll still talk about them because it's very interesting for this overall context. Another thing that I would love to get into is the Phoenix Rising documentary that Evan Rachel Wood and Illma Gore created, which is on HBO right now and I believe was intended to basically document their experience of creating the Phoenix Act and coming out with the accusations against Marilyn Manson. So it's pretty centrally relevant to this particular case. And then we'll get into other media appearances by any of these individuals involved in any of these cases, including Evan Rachel Wood's testimony in front of the House Judiciary Subcommittee and in front of the California Senate Public Safety Committee, having to do with the Phoenix Act, having to do with all of these similar issues. So as we go down this massive rabbit hole together, I anticipate that this is probably going to be a long-term project that we will be going into. And as we do go down that rabbit hole, I hope that we can all keep an open mind to all of the facts, the good, the bad, the ugly, and continue to make our analyses and our conclusions as we go along. And even as we do make conclusions, keep a little bit of an open mind, even with those conclusions, because there's always a possibility that more evidence can come in to change the way that picture looks. So with that, I'll see you in the next video.